Hello world, you're right world. So today I thought, although I feel really tired because I'm functioning on minimal sleep today, I thought I would get myself motivated enough to make a video for YouTube. I've had this idea for a little while now, brewing in my head, about making a series of videos about the actual stereo and mono differences on the Beatles albums. And so I thought I would start that today. And we're going to start obviously right at the very beginning with Please Please Me and With the Beatles, the first two UK albums. Now I need to make a little proviso here. When I say stereo and mono differences, I am talking about the albums as they were first released. Now don't panic here. I'm not expecting anybody to have a gold label stereo and a gold label mono Please Please Me, because that will set you back hundreds of pounds. But what I'm saying is that anything on vinyl released from the original release date of the album up until 1987, when they were transferred to CD, those are really the parameters that I'm talking about here. What I'm trying to do is kind of go back to the start, as it were, as these things were originally released. If there's a story behind a particular song, then I'll try and tell it. But otherwise, I'm just going to sort of go over the main things to look out for when you're listening to a Beatles album with, you've got a mono copy and a stereo copy. What are the key differences between the two? There will be loads of sort of micro differences, as it were, but we're just concerning ourselves with the key differences. Now, to start off with them, we're looking at Please Please Me. Just here. And the key date that we're after here is actually, although this was released in 1963, we're going back to 1962, the 4th of September 1962, to be honest. Now, this was not the first time the Beatles had ever been in a recording studio. They'd done some recording out in Hamburg with a guy called Tony Sheridan. But yeah, it's like the difference between you going into a railway station and finding one of those photo booth things and having 4 little snaps taken of you for your passport, and you going to a photographer's studio with your family to have yourselves beautiful portraits taken of yourselves. There's all the difference in the world. Those, the 62 recordings were, they were just, crappy things. And as far as the Beatles were concerned, going to London to EMI Parlophone and having their first single released and foisted upon the UK general public was like, a great thing. And, you've got to remember that at that time, the north-south divide was such that London was incredibly prejudiced about people coming from the north. These were 4 scruffy, ne'er-do-well kids that, had a few hundred people who were following them in Liverpool, but, were really not really doing anything else. They were given a standard contract. For standard, read shit. It was awful, as I've spoken about before, and nobody really expected very much from these 4 chaps, really. So they trundled up to George Martin on the 4th of September 1962, and they recorded Love Me Do. By the time that they'd finished, they said the drumming isn't quite what we wanted. And so they arranged to come back the following week on the 11th and re-record Love Me Do with a session drummer. Now, I have sat here and I have pondered what on earth could have been wrong with Ringo Starr's drumming. Ringo Starr was a blooming good drummer, even in the early 60s. He'd been drumming for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He was pretty much in demand. So the Beatles had dumped Pete Best as drummer, in favour of Ringo Starr. So there was no way that Ringo Starr was actually a poor drummer. So what on earth could have been wrong? And for that, we need to kind of consider that we've now, again, I'm hypothesizing here. I don't know for definite, but what we do know is that nobody has ever come out of the woodwork and said that Andy White the following week played the drum pattern any different from Ringo. There's absolutely no sort of grounds at all for saying that Andy White kept the rhythm better or he played better drum fills or anything like that. The drum parts seem pretty much identical on both recordings. However, there is such a thing as a studio drummer, and a studio drummer knows that they are going to record onto tape or digital, whatever, and that a drum kit is blooming loud. I know that. As a school teacher, I arranged on a few occasions to get drummers in to come and drum for the children because it's great, it's exciting and what have you. But I can remember the first time I did so, I was absolutely flabbergasted that you could actually hear this drummer in every single classroom, down every single corridor. He was in the hall playing. There would have been a little bit of acoustics and reverb and what have you from being in the hall, but the classrooms, as it were down the stairs, along corridors, round the corner, along more corridors, and there wasn't a single classroom in that building where you could not hear this drummer. It was absolutely deafening. So to try and capture that onto a tape without it distorting, without it making a cheap 1960s dance set suitcase style record player tone arm jump out of its skin and scratch and what have you is very difficult. It's very difficult indeed. And it may well be that Andy White had a better idea of how to capture the excitement of a drum kit without actually playing it too loudly, because because Ringo, as I say, he was a live drummer, and he basically was probably just a little bit too aggressive, over passionate for his own good. Maybe it was the first time that he was going to be projected onto the world as well, and he wanted to try and sort of show off a bit as a drummer, and it kind of backfired on him a little bit. Now that story kind of bears itself out, because out of the 4th of September and the 11th of September versions, George Martin, who's trying to distance himself here, he always has distanced himself from ever releasing Andy White at all. But he said, well, that there was really sod all difference between the two, except that on the 11th of September, Andy White was playing drums, Ringo was playing tambourine. That's how you can tell the difference between the first two Love Me Do things. And by the way, we're recording in mono here. We're only releasing a single. We're recording in mono. We've got a 2-track tape recorder. We're recording the instruments on one track, the vocals on the other. We're going to blend the two together very nicely to create a mono master of that single. Okay, and that's how the whole of Please Please Me essentially was recorded. But we'll come on to that. All right. So as far as George Martin was concerned, Ringo's version of Love Me Do was okay, good enough, and he kind of left it there. But quality control, and every single release had to go through quality control. Quality control was basically a bunch of guys who were playing each release on various different grades of record player, from the Magnavox piece of furniture to a stereo record player to a mono record player to a little tiny little crappy thing like a Crosley or a dance set or whatever, and trying to essentially break it, trying to get it to jump. That's basically what they wanted to do. They went for Andy White, but for some reason or other, the first copy of Love Me Do, which had P.S. I Love You on the back, we'll come back to that one in a second, was Ringo's version. It was spotted very quickly and withdrawn after a few days of release and substituted for Andy White's version. However, there were some people who kind of found in the 1980s that they had copies of Ringo Starr's version of Love Me Do, the one without the tambourine, and they contacted EMI. 2 copies basically surfaced, one in 1981, which was very, very noisy and crackly. They managed to kind of clean it up as best they could in the early 80s, doing with whatever technology they had, but it wasn't good enough for release. In 1982, there was due to be a 20th anniversary re-release of Love Me Do, and that version was not deemed good enough. In 1984, another version of Ringo's Love Me Do turned up, and EMI snaffled it, and it was a better quality or slightly better quality version, and even on that better quality version you can hear distortion. So whether or not my story of Ringo Starr's drumming causing that distortion, I don't know, but I think I'm kind of borne out in my theory that there was really nothing per se wrong with Ringo's drumming. It was just that Andy White had a better idea at the time of how to record onto a studio tape without it distorting. Its B-side, P.S. I Love You, was recorded on the same day with Andy White, so the 11th of September. So on the mono and the stereo editions of Please Please Me, you will find the Andy White versions of both those songs. There was never a Ringo Starr on drums for P.S. I Love You. Ringo Starr played percussion. He was showcased a bit because that song has got an absolutely beautiful percussion part. So, you know, there's, you know, although he is just sort of relegated to tambourine on Love Me Do, on P.S. I Love You, you can actually see Ringo's talent. Now, those 2 songs were recorded on the 11th of September, as I say, and then they were mixed down into mono, and then the 2 original, we'll call them multi-track, but they're really 2-track tapes. The original ones, after they were mixed down, were binned, erased with a bulk eraser, and used again. EMI had, though, however, wanted to get into stereo recording, or at least releasing stereo mixes of these albums. Now, George Martin claims that he didn't know that Please Please Me was going to be released in stereo, and he wasn't aware of the original stereo release. And he said, and basically, that if he had been aware of it, he would have tried to stop it, because the way that the tape machines were configured, the way that they were mic'd up and everything, was all to make a mono record. They could have done it in stereo. And then kind of bounced it down to mono. But the thinking in those days was that stereo that's bounced down into mono doesn't sound quite as good on mono equipment, and basically you want to make a record that is purely a mono record. And so to have that mono record then dissected so that you've got all the instruments on one side, the left as it were, the vocals on the right hand side, is really not good. It's not proper stereo. They were well aware of that, but they made this decision that they were going to record in mono. And George Martin has stood by and said, I wasn't aware that there was a stereo remix. And when in 1987 EMI said that they were making CDs, and we're going to release the first 4 albums, and we're releasing them in stereo, George Martin said, over my dead body, are you? And he got his way, and they let him supervise mono transfers of those first 4 CDs. Okay, they didn't really do too much to them apart from trying to make sure that they were as faithful reproduction as 16-bit 44 CD will allow you. And I actually think that they're not bad. They're really not bad. But anyway, that's kind of getting off the point. So we've got Love Me Do. We've got this on Please Please Me. Then on Please Please Me, we haven't got the original master tapes to go back and make this left and right stereo mix at all. So the original stereo copies of Please Please Me, and we're talking about anything up to 1987 released on vinyl or cassette. So you're looking at like the yellow and black Parlophone labels, the 1-box Parlophone labels, the 2-box Parlophone labels, anything up to 1987. The stereo version is actually a mock stereo version of Love Me Do and a mock stereo version of P.S. I Love You. The mock stereo version of Love Me Do is actually awful. It's basically just sounds like it's all on the right hand side, a little bit kind of spread out, so it goes to the right and centre, but there's really nothing going on in your left ear at all. I listened to it on headphones last night. It's horrific. Just don't. All right. So that's a key difference with that single. And then we've got Please Please Me. Now, Please Please Me was originally recorded on the same day as Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. There is an outtake with Andy White playing the drums that was never used. The Beatles came back to Abbey Road to record Please Please Me on, I think it's the 26th of November 1962 for an early 1963 release. By that time, they had to persuade George Martin to let them record Please Please Me. They always wanted How Do You Do It, which was subsequently released by Jerry and the Pacemakers, but they'd always wanted that to be the main single or the next single. But the Beatles dutifully recorded How Do You Do It. There are archival recordings of it. It does survive. I think it might even be on one of the anthology albums, the first anthology album. Don't quote me on that. By this time, as I say, EMI wanted stereo, but for some reason or other, the Beatles recorded Please Please Me, got a great take of it, lovely mix. What they had to do was, with the harmonica parts, because there were, particularly towards the end of the song, the harmonica and the voices occur at the same time. So what they did was they recorded them playing it without the harmonica, and then when they were going to copy that down, instruments on one side, vocals on the other, and they copied it down and they mixed it into mono at the same time as John overdubbing his harmonica part in the right places. And then, given that EMI wanted to go into stereo, it doesn't really make any sense at all, but the multi-track, the 2-track multi thingy of that take was destroyed. So, go figure. Ask Me Why, which was recorded on the same day, for some reason they kept the original 2-track thing so that they could release it in stereo. Instruments on the left, vocals on the right. It actually sounds really good. I think Ask Me Why, if it had been released as a single by anybody else, would have made #1. As I say, it was only a B-side for the Beatles, but you know, I'd say that, you know, it could have been a #1 single easily. It's a really, really nice song, and it sounds okay in stereo, not perfect. All right, there were 2 mono mixes made of Ask Me Why. One in November 1962, and that was the one that ended up on the B-side of the single. And then there was another one made, I think it's the 25th of February 63. There's another one made which was no different from the first mix, but that was the one that you hear on Please Please Me. And as I say, when you're listening to Ask Me Why, in stereo and mono, there's not really a huge difference between them, other than the instruments on the left, the vocals on the right. Okay. Now, Please Please Me is an entirely different story, because, as I say, they destroyed the mono masters of Please Please Me. So when it came to mixing a stereo version, what they had to do was go back to a take where the Beatles were playing without the harmonica, because, as I say, the harmonica was overdubbed when it was being copied into mono. But of course, there wasn't the original take that they used for the single, because that had been destroyed. So they had to find another take. The other take had a fluff up in the vocals on it, in the final verse. I know you never even try, girl, and then somebody else, either John or Paul, sang, you know I never even try, girl, or something, whatever. It was just singing a slightly different line. They realise they've made this fluff, and then Come On is sung with a slight chuckle afterwards, and that's how, you know, you can really tell that that is the stereo version. The mono version doesn't have that. The stereo version as well had problems with the harmonica, because the Beatles were not there for the mixing of any of their albums or at that stage. You know, you've recorded it, off you go, do your touring and your TV appearances and whatever. You know, we'll see you back when we record the next one, kind of thing. And so all of this was done sort of in the sort of mixing room kind of thing, without the Beatles there. And yeah, people wore suits and ties and white coats and goodness knows what else while they were doing it. So where do we get this harmonica from? Because we haven't got the boys here. We're making this stereo mix. It's the 25th of February 1963. We're making this stereo mix. Where do we get the harmonica from? So what they did was they took this other tape of the original vocal and backing track that, as I say, had that vocal fluff on, and panned that left and right. So we've got instruments on the left, vocals on the right, but also, while they were mixing it down, they synced another tape machine to play the mono mix, the original mono mix, along with it. Now, syncing 2 tape machines is not an easy thing. You can try it and see how far it goes before you realise that the 2 are out of sync. They will not stay in sync for very long. It was really difficult, and they never really nailed that problem until sort of 66, 67, when they were recording Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper was very reliant on having 2 tape machines playing in sync. In 1963, as it were, that was pretty difficult. Okay, so they're playing along this sort of slightly flubbed stereo take of Please Please Me, along with the original mono song on the right hand side, so that the harmonica appears on the right, you've got instruments on the left, you've got vocals on the right, and then this harmonica kind of comes in. Every time the harmonica comes in the stereo version, you'll hear that it suddenly gets extra bassy. And the bass appears to move to the centre, or rather it doesn't. What actually happens, it does kind of move to the centre, but you're not really aware of that. What you're aware of is that every time the harmonica stops, the bass appears to jump back to the left-hand channel. And that's another key difference. And by the time we get to the end of that, as I say, the two tape machines have come out of sync, and they so that by the time we get to the final U at the end, that's got the harmonica sort of playing da 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 da, it's way out. It all appears to go a bit psychedelic before the word psychedelic had even been invented. And it's sort of, you know, it goes all spacey, wacy, whatever, and then stops. And so if you want a definitive version of it, you've really got to go back to the mono version. It's the mono version that has no vocal flubs in it, and it also has a harmonica that's playing in time. Why on earth we've got Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You that have been moved into fake stereo for the stereo edition, and really there's really nothing sort of audibly different about it. So why on earth do we want Please Please Me in stereo? Well, because the album's called Please Please Me. We're releasing a stereo version of it, and incidentally it came out later than the mono version, a couple of weeks later or something. We must have Please Please Me in stereo, which was why they had to go back to an inferior take and overdub the harmonica in from a mono version of the complete mix. Okay, you know, as I say, fading down the verses or wherever they're singing, fading it up when there's harmonica. And as I say, by the end of the record, the harmonica is totally out of sync and it all goes a bit spacey wacy. And those really are the chief differences. It's in those four songs, the singles as it were, that you're going to hear any kind of difference at all. The two fake stereos, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, and then the botched up stereo mix of Please Please Me, and the beautiful stereo mix as it was, really. It's really nice, of Ask Me Why. Okay, those are your chief differences. All right, now, by the time we get to the Beatles' third single, which was called From Me to You, they'd kind of got this harmonica bit kind of down to a T. We've got a backing track, vocals on one side, and then we've got instruments on the other. Okay, there's an overdub at the beginning. The overdub is of the da 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 dun dun da introduction. Okay, now instead of that being placed on the right hand side or the left hand side, as it was for the stereo of Please Please Me, it was actually recorded onto both tracks. So the stereo version of From Me to You has those vocals da 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 dun dun da in the middle, and then when we get to If There's Anything That You Want, they shift to one side. And I can't remember which side it is now, and I only listened to it last night. Let's just pretend that they're on the right to kind of sort of, yes, they are on the right. I know they're on the right. Okay. So they're on the right, instruments are on the left. Okay. Then we get to the instrumental part, okay, which has a harmonica on it. That harmonica has been overdubbed. You've got this basic stereo mix. The harmonica has been overdubbed. At the same time as that was being overdubbed, there were extra vocals going on to the introduction, as I say, on both tracks, okay? And it's the same with the harmonica. It's being recorded on both tracks, okay? Rather than just one, which would make it appear one side or the other. Because it's on both tracks, the harmonica kind of goes into the middle, All right. Now I'm deliberately saying that the harmonica comes in the instrumental because there is no version where or of the original multitracks that has the harmonica at the beginning. Although the single actually has a harmonica at the beginning. How did it get a harmonica at the beginning, you ask? Well, because they took when they had got this satisfactory mix of the single, they actually went to the instrumental part and synced that up to the beginning of the song, so that then the harmonica appears in the center as well. All right, so it's actually quite a composite recording. Okay, it was never given a stereo mix until 1966 because it was never needed to, and they, for whatever reason, didn't bother to sync up the harmonica at the beginning. As I say, they've for the mono, they'd actually taken the instrumental section of that and kind of did a copy and paste of it and synced it up to the introduction. Again, that means that if you want a definitive mix of From Me to You, it is the mono version, which you'll find today on the mono masters. It was never put onto an album in the Beatles' lifetime until we got to a collection of Beatles oldies but goldies. As I say, when that 1966 mix was done, they'd forgotten all about the harmonica at the beginning, and it's also horrific, given that this is 1966 as well. There's some, and even the Beatles anomalies list, which I consulted last night, the What Goes On Beatles anomalies list thing, does not actually mention this, but there's a huge amount of random booming on the vocal channel. It's almost like somebody is singing into a microphone too close to it with no sort of de-esser or anything, so that when you know how people kind of put this sort of netting in front of a microphone to try and catch saliva and to stop and it's almost like they forgot to use one of those, and it's going boom 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 boom. But it's also not, because it comes in places where they're not singing at all, and it's really irritating. So I would say steer clear of the stereo mix of From Me to You. I know that by the time we got to the CD version of the Red album, which came out in 1993, they'd done an awful lot of cleaning up to those songs. All of those twin track songs. All right. So we've got From Me to You. Another single that we need to talk about is She Loves You. She Loves You, for some reason or other, what did they go and do but destroy the 2-track master for some reason or other? Oh, it's going to be a single, we'll record over it, we'll wipe over the 2-track, because we've got a satisfactory, and I put that in quotes, mix of the song on a mono thing, so we'll destroy that. The other conspiracy theory is that somebody stole the original 2-track of She Loves You, and it's still in existence somewhere. But that, I believe, is almost like Elvis is still alive as well. But there are a few very, very prominent edits in She Loves You, which means that the original mono mix did not work quite as well. Particularly where the song kind of goes round. It makes this sort of transition down, that where you get those little bits, the drums keep dropping out, or the cymbals at least keep dropping out, just for sort of split seconds. The first time you hear it, it's at 12 seconds, right? Then there's also a very prominent edit which comes just before Pride Can Hurt You to apologise to her in the last verse, okay? And then it gets sort of, so that's obviously a splice in, and then it kind of finishes on Because She Loves You, and then that bit is spliced out, as it were, and it goes back into the original take. And so really, there is not a stereo version of She Loves You. Any album that claims to be in stereo that has She Loves You on it has a fake stereo version. And again, that fake stereo version appeared on a collection of Beatles oldies but goldies, and then on the Red album again in '73. People have tried to tweak it. It was retweaked for the CD issue of the Red album. It works a wee bit better. But yeah, it's, you know, again, you know, don't sort of get yourself excited about mono stereo differences for She Loves You, because there really aren't any. It was basically a fake stereo made from the mono final mixdown. So yeah, that's really all I've got to say about the songs from Please Please Me and the singles that go around there. We'll have a twaddle, a very quick twaddle with the Beatles. Now, with the Beatles, there's not really a huge amount of difference between the mono and stereo versions. There's one very significant difference, which I'll explain to you a wee bit later. But this album was made with considerably more care than the first album. Okay, it was made over a couple of weeks rather than 10 songs in one day and 2 singles and people destroying twin track tapes. The method of recording this was still the same. Okay, we had not got onto 4-track yet. We were still using 2-track. All right, there were considerably more overdubs though on a lot of these songs. For example, Little Child started out with the basic instruments on one track, vocals on the other, and then we had an overdub, so that meant that the instruments and vocals had to be blended down to the next level tape while we're playing another instrument or doing some backing vocals. And then you've got, in fact, actually, if we look at Little Child, so Little Child is Paul McCartney playing the piano. John and Paul joined forces for the vocal, and whilst Paul was overdubbing his piano bits, John was standing beside another microphone, adding in some neatly timed mouth organ phrases. That's what it says on the back here, okay? But actually, that's actually 4 different overdubs. Every time you make a copy of a tape, you're building up hiss. All right, so it's absolutely vital that you get it right first time. Okay, so we've got Paul on piano. We have then got another overdub with John and Paul on backing vocals, and then we've got John doing some extra harmonica phrases. So that's actually a 4th generation twin track recording. Okay, they were really pushing the boat out there, and I reckon that they couldn't wait to get 4-track, okay? Because Little Child is basically, you know, a tour de force, and quite a lot of the songs were like that. And another, you know, particularly prominent example is Money. Now, Money sounds completely different in mono and stereo, okay? It's very hard to put your finger on it. The introductions are completely different, but it turns out again that the stereo version of Money was made by syncing 2 takes of, or 2 mono takes together. It's the only song on the album, and it's a shame that it comes right at the very end, but it's the only song on the album where the vocals actually appear to be in the middle. And why? Because when you sync 2 people singing virtually the same thing, okay, even if you've got one on the left and one on the right, they will appear to drift into the center because they're doing the same thing, okay? And so, yeah, we've got these 2 sort of tracks running simultaneously. For whatever reason, because they took longer over it, maybe, they've managed to get those two tape machines to play in sync a little bit. But as I say, the stereo and mono editions of Money are very, very different, and that is really the only significant difference. There are other differences between mono and stereo. For example, the balance between the instruments and vocals on You Really Got a Hold on Me is different in mono. The instruments are quieter than the stereo version. The mono version, they do fade up a little bit towards the end of the song, but you know, by and large, the instruments are quieter than on the stereo version. But that's really it. There's not really anything to write home about in terms of, you know, audible differences between the mono and the stereo of With the Beatles. By the time we got towards the end of 1963, hooray, we have got 4 tracks. We now have a 4-track tape machine. It didn't really change the way that they worked or recorded or whatever. What it just meant was that rather than bunching all the instruments onto one track, they could actually spread them out a little bit, maybe record them onto 2 tracks and have some vocals on track 3 and some backing vocals on track 4, whatever. So that by the time that we've got to I Wanna Hold Your Hand and the B-side of I Wanna Hold Your Hand, which I think is this boy, it's really a much better stereo mix that you've got of that. Although having said that, I Want to Hold Your Hand, what was it? A single. What aren't singles released in, children? Stereo. So essentially, again, the only version that was in existence was a mono one up until 1966, when it was mixed into stereo, and mixed very well into stereo, with guitars sort of seemingly bouncing from, you know, one side of the stereo stage to the other, and just, you know, you've got this sort of, you know, echolalia kind of thing going on. Except that that wasn't quite the story, because George Martin did actually attempt in 1963 to do his first ever stereo mix from a 4-track with I Wanna Hold Your Hand. And he did it in 1963. He didn't like it. For some reason, the tape of it survived, and it got sent by accident to Australia, who released it, and it came out in Germany as well a year or so later. But it wasn't actually an authorised kind of stereo thing. George Martin did not like it. And so therefore it kind of got shelved, and they made a better version of it in 1966, which ended up being the one that we all hear today. Okay, and that really is the end of this first video. All right, so, you know, to summarize very briefly, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, PS I Love You, and Ask Me Why are the 4 tracks that are significantly different on the mono Please Please Me to the stereo one. In particular, the song Please Please Me. And on With the Beatles, we've got basically Money, which is the track that is completely different in mono and stereo. Okay, From Me to You has no harmonica at the beginning in the stereo version. She Loves You, there's no difference really between the two of them, except that in the mono one, the edits are more prominent than in the fake stereo version. And I Want to Hold Your Hand, again, not really any major differences there. So there we go. I will come back with A Hard Day's Night and For Sale. As you can imagine, although I've been kind of researching these albums for most of my life, really, reading the Mark Lewis and studio recordings and the What Goes On website for Anomalies, and also there's a website called the Usenet Guide to Beatles Variations, which I'll try and put in the description below. But yeah, it takes a lot. Okay, and as you can tell, I'm really tired today, and trying to find the motivation to kind of get up out of bed even is actually quite difficult, let alone make YouTube videos. But I really want to keep making YouTube videos. This series then, I probably won't deal with as many albums on sort of future videos, because it's actually really complicated. So there might be some videos where I do one at a time, but there's a good sort of half a dozen videos that are going to come out of doing this series. All right, so yes, thank you everybody for listening thus far. I will get on and edit this video now and try and get it up in the next hour or so. All right, thank you, bye bye.